Okay, this is skill acquisition lesson 3 on the types of practice. So moving on from last week's lesson, we're still imagining that we're a coach or a PE teacher, and we're still imagining that we're delivering sessions. But this time we're not looking at presenting the practice, we're looking at how you actually deliver the practice in terms of rest periods and drills. Hopefully by the end of the session you'll be able to describe the different types of practice, which we have 4, and explain the advantages and disadvantages of each type. Again, we need to consider the type of skill we're actually delivering, who the performers are, and what the environment's going to be like. So the first type of practice we've got is known as mass practice. This is where we practice continually with no rest, no recovery in between the session. Really good for closed skills that can be repeated over and over again, such as a shot put, because we don't need that rest in between. Good for simple skills, because complex skills will require a little bit more mental rehearsal, a bit more kind of motivation and reflection in between the sessions. And really good for discrete skills that happen quite quickly to retain the fluency. Autonomous performers mainly use mass practice to develop the feel of the skill and make it more skill related and related to the game. They've got to be really motivated if they're not getting any rest or recovery in between the sessions, and they've got to be really fit also. You wouldn't really use mass practice with a dangerous environment, so it's got to be a safe environment, and it is really good if you've got limited time available. The opposite to mass practice is known as distributed. This is where we do have rest in between the actual sessions in training, and it's particularly good for open skills because it allows the coach to give some feedback on the changing environment and how well skills have been performed. Good for complex skills because it allows the performer to actually reflect on how well they've performed it and to get the mental break in between. And good to reduce the boredom of continuous skills, but also the fatigue element as well. So if you've got something like long distance runners, make sure they change the practice sessions with kind of rest periods in between to reduce the fatigue element. Cognitive performers benefit from distributed practice because they can get some feedback in between, and it's good for less motivated performers to improve the confidence when they get that positive praise from the coach, and it will allow unfit performers to have a rest period in between the sessions. Good for dangerous environments that can be quite mentally taxing on the performer. However, it only needs to be done, or only can be done when there's lots of time available, as it does take longer with the rest periods. Varied practice is slightly different, so this is where we completely change the practice types regularly and the drills that are going to be done. Really good for open skills as it reflects the changing environment of the game. Good for simple skills. You wouldn't really change the practice type for a complex skill because it would be too complicated for the performer. And really good to reduce the boredom for continuous skills such as cycling or running, because if long distance runners all they would do is running at the same intensity all the time, it'd be very boring for them. So you might want to get them to do interval training or hill training, for example. Good to retain the interest for cognitive performers, and again for less motivated, it allows them to get their feedback in between the actual change in the practice type to improve that motivation, and it allows unfit performers to get a rest in between the practice type. It can only be used in a safe environment, so you wouldn't change the practice type for rock climbing, canoeing, sailing, and it does take more time than mass practice. Mental practice is a different type of practice that can be done by all performers. So this is where the performer or the athlete goes through the performance of what they're about to perform in the head without any movement. There's 2 types of mental practice. Firstly, internal is where you see the performance from within through your own eyes and imagine that you're watching yourself, or you imagine that you're somebody else watching you perform as a spectator. Either way, it can be done by cognitive performers to help to build a mental image of what the skill looks like, and used by autonomous to allow them to focus on tactics and strategies. You can use it for complex skills as well to help you to go over what you should be doing before you perform the skill. Okay, advantages, disadvantages now. Mass practice, really good, improves fitness of the performer, develops the kinesthesis and keeps the fluency of the movement, helps the performer to overlearn the skill through repetition to allow the motor programs to be formed and stored in the long-term memory. Problem is, if you're unfit, it might cause fatigue, There's no time for feedback in between the session, and it's not good for cognitive learners. They need that rest period in between. It might become boring or decrease the motivation if the performer's not being successful. Distributed practice, on the other hand, does allow time for recovery, for feedback, and for mental practice in between the sessions, and it might reduce the boredom for cognitive performers, less motivated, and for those continuous skills. It is more time consuming, however, and you might lose some of that fluency and kinestheses when you try and kind of put the skills into the game related environment, so it's not very realistic to the game. Varied practice is really good because that is realistic to the changing environment of team games, does prevent boredom, and allows the performer to develop something called schema, which is building up a range of responses. So it allows a footballer, for example, to develop a range of passes over different distances. It is more time consuming than mass practice, might cause information overload by changing it too much, and there might be some negative transfer between changing the drills of the skills. Mental practice, really good because it improves confidence, reaction time, because you've already sending the inputs to your muscles before you perform the skill, and it can be done by injured players to help them to retain that muscle memory. However, it's quite difficult for some cognitive performers to do effectively if they've not already developed a knowledge of how to perform a skill. Might not be time available to do this before every skill, especially if it's in a game situation, and if the mental image is not accurate, it's going to lead to an incorrect copying of the skill. Okay, so make sure you go over your notes properly now, create a summary at the bottom, and write out your 4 or 5 questions.